All right, hi there. This is a basic intro to UVs. This isn't going to really be Blender specific. This is mostly about what UVs are and how UVs work, but I will go over a couple of good things to know as well as how to make your UVs in Blender. But this knowledge should apply to any program. And another thing to note is I'm not the greatest at UVs in Blender. I'm come from Maya, and I'm still more comfortable with Maya's UV tools, and I'm still learning Blender's, but the basic concepts of everything are the same between both the programs. So first, let's discuss what UVs are. So we're going to start with this basic cube, and here we can see the UVs over on the left. So the UVs are like the candy wrapped or skinned version of your model that you need so that you can produce textures. So important things to note is something called texel density. This space over here on the left is called the UV space or the 0 to 1 space, and it is a grid that repeats infinitely. So if I move my UVs, you'll see that even when it comes off the grid, they still get the checker texture applied to them, and it just loops around like Pac-Man. So right becomes left, left becomes right, up becomes down, so on and so on. Now, the texel density I referred to earlier is how large each UV island or chunk is. This here is what we call a UV island or chunk. The terms can be kind of interchangeable. People will also call them a shell. And so, texel density is how large each one is, or each part of it is. Now, you'll see each face is equally split up and equally ratioed so that it gets equal texture detail. If I start to move this face, you'll see that the UV stretches with it, and it will lose texture detail as well as become stretched. So I'm going to separate each face into its own island. Oops. So I'm just going to do that by selecting all the edges and marking a seam. All right, and now each face is its own island. So you can see I can move them independently. When I make this smaller, you'll see that the grid enlarges, and that means that face will get less detail. You'll see the blurry edges of our checker map versus the crisper edges here. So the reason texel density is so important is because if you don't have consistent texel density, parts of your object will look at different resolutions. You can also use this to your advantage for things that aren't going to be seen very often or things that aren't important. You can shrink the UVs and make space for more important things. So if this were like some kind of cartoony character face or something, like some kind of slime or something, perhaps I could shrink all of the faces but one, and then enlarge this one and say this is my face. So the rest of these are just like details. Just the other sides. This one large face is the actual face of the slime. So if I needed more detail on this particular face, I would want it to be larger. The issue is when detail crosses between the faces, you'll notice a change in resolution. So you just have to be careful if you're going to have differently sized UV islands. But that is texel density, and that's how that works. So we're just going to get this back to how it was. All right. And now let's move on to another important thing. So we're going to look at a cylinder, and you'll notice how this is unfolded. It's like a paper towel roll, basically. And almost anything that's cylindrical can be thought of like a paper towel roll, where you can cut the cylindrical part in half and unfold it into like a flat sheet, and then you'll have the tops and bottoms as their own caps. And just adding in one thing I forgot. When you extrude a face, it's not going to generate UVs for them. So you'll see every time I do this, you'll have spaces with no UVs. So a lot of the time, whenever you're done modeling something, the UVs will be unusable because you've probably extruded and moved stuff around. So what you want to do is you want to create new UVs entirely. which you can just do by doing U and project from view. And these are still unusable, but now every single face has a UV assigned to it. And then you can just go in and cut the UVs as necessary to make it unfold in a nice way. So I'm just going to chop this up a bunch, and then we'll unfold it. And I'm kind of arbitrarily placing these, but there is a bit of thought going into it. All right, let's see. Okay, and then I'm going to mark my seam, A. And now I've got some nice UVs for everything. So that's how you can create UVs from scratch. You want to project from view just to make sure that every single face has UV assigned to it. For something like this, one of the better ways to UV it is to simply create a seam inside of it and then one seam here, and you'll be able to unwrap it into a nice square like this. Another thing that's good to know is on more complicated objects, your bevels tend to be pretty good guides for where your UVs might go, and they can help you arrange things. So we're going to look at the UVs of this guy. And one thing that's important to note is you want to maximize the UV space as well as you can. Any space that you are not using is wasted UV space. So you really want to try and fill it up as much as you can, be efficient with your spacing. You also need to have just a little bit of distance between them. The distance here between each piece is actually rather large. You can just have 2 to 3 pixels of distance, and that tends to work pretty well too, depending on your texture resolution. So you want to have very dense, tightly packed UVs so that you're not wasting any of this 0 to 1 space. So there's a couple of different ways you can chop an object like this up depending on your needs. So one way is you can follow the bevels, and you'll see I also have a slice here to turn those rings into squares. And the reason you want to do that, it's not always what you want to do. Sometimes having a ring can be useful, but rings tend to take up a lot more space. So by turning them into strips, you can really save on your UV space. So the way that it's UV'd right now, it follows the bevels and has each side kind of separated into its own part. So a lot of the time you can think, most of the time if you have a hard edge on your object, it's probably not a bad idea to put a UV seam there. There's some other ways we could also unwrap this. So we're going to go ahead and clear seams, and we're going to do a different way of unwrapping it. The issue with this right now is there's some stretching. So we want to try and minimize that. So let's try a different method of unwrapping it and see how that goes. So we're just going to clear the seams, and this time we're going to do something pretty simple. We're just going to try to unwrap it like we did the other one. So we're going to mark seam A and unwrap. All right, and that gives us a shape like this. Now you'll see we have a bunch of stretching, so that is still not great. What I would rather do is instead of having a cut in the middle like this, we're going to separate this into a series of strips. So just like that, and we can use our bevels as good guides for where our strips should go. All right. And then I'm going to move where this seam is here so it doesn't create asymmetrical strips. And we're going to mark this seam here. And now we're going to unwrap it. And you'll see that we have a lot less stretching. Now these here, we can go through and straighten them out, and there's also some add-ons to do so. So the add-ons, sometimes they do well with this kind of stuff, sometimes they don't. So let's give it a shot and just see how it does. Let's see. All right. So it looks like it did all right, but we'll need some cleanup by hand because I got a little confused on what to do with these points here. And now those are overlapping. You don't want overlapping points because those will lead to issues, as you can probably expect. So things you can do to alleviate that is you can cut stuff, or you can just manually rotate and move this stuff around. And you can also use the add-on on just parts of it, and that can make moving and rotating it a little easier. So we're going to go ahead and try rotating this, and it can be pretty useful to use your cursor as the point to rotate around. So you'll see how I can just use my cursor to straighten this stuff out. And I'm just going to move this over here so that it's a little easier to select this stuff without having to worry about anything else. And just going to use my cursor as my point of rotation. And save myself a ton of space and headache by straightening this stuff out. All right. And then you can just straighten out the edges as you need to. And basically, it's just doing that and cleaning it up. And that's one of the ways you can straighten stuff out. So I don't want to spend forever doing that. So we're just going to go ahead and come over to this one. Another approach you can use is you can chop stuff up. The issue to note about doing it this way is that the more seams you have, the more obvious they can look. So you really just want to try and hide your seams as well as you can. And putting seams on flat surfaces like this, because it's going to go on this flat part of the ring, can create obvious seams. So you just want to be careful with how you texture. If you have a program like Substance Painter, you can usually get away with it. But if you're trying to do it with Photoshop or another 2D program, it can be a little harder. So we're going to go ahead and mark those as seams and then unfold these. And then these will be much easier to straighten. So boom, nice and straight. And now those are nice squares. They're way too big though, so our texel density would be off. So we want to resize those until they look all right. And then there's going to be some stretching sometimes if you straighten them like that, and then you just got to clean that up some. In Maya, there's a very easy way to make these into squares without the stretching. I haven't quite figured out the same approach in Blender yet, so it's just a little bit of a struggle. Just clean stuff up, move some points around, and try to keep your UVs square if possible because it looks professional, it saves you texel density, and it just overall looks nice on your portfolio. So that's some basic kind of primitives UV'd, but that's not all we can do. I also have a character I was commissioned to work on, and we're going to look at his UVs. And once again, they're not perfect because I'm still learning Blender's UV systems. But you'll see that I have them tightly packed, and there's a new concept I want to demonstrate here. So I also have this character He's got a couple of different texel densities, which we can do. We can check by using my text tools add-on to give him a checker map, and you'll see that there's some slightly different texel densities, and it's just based on what I think is important. Um, so like his hands are mostly just a white texture, so I went ahead and scaled them down a good bit. Meanwhile, his face is pretty important, so it has pretty high texel density. So the texel density is kind of just dependent on your needs. And I have to reassign his materials now. So I think the fastest way to do that, I'm just going to open up the older version of this file here. All right. And let's hide these. Okay. So now for his UVs, there's also a new concept I'd like to demonstrate. Now then, keeping everything in the 0 to 1 space is good, just like this, but sometimes you want more detail, and you don't want to sacrifice as much of the UV space as you could. So in that event, if you have stuff that's going to be symmetrical, one thing you can do to really save on your texel density is to actually have your UVs overlapped and flipped. So if we see on his back here, I believe this piece is his back, and we can make sure of that by setting the UVs to his texture, and you'll see how they fit. Okay, here's his back. So you'll see I only have one side of his back done, and that's because I actually have two UVs stacked here. One is his left side, and the other is his right side, and it's just flipped and mirrored. And the reason for that is so that I can save myself a bunch of texture space by just having these stacked like this. The issue is that if any detail goes across, it's going to be perfectly mirrored. So sometimes with more realistic objects, you want to be careful with this. But it's most useful if the objects aren't crossing the symmetry line. So this is really nice for stuff like hands because they can have identical but mirrored textures, and you'll never really know because they're never going to cross the symmetry line like the torso would. So that's pretty good. So I've just tried to make as efficient UV space as possible, and you'll see that I've tried to make as many things square as I could without distorting the textures too much. And I could have done a lot better of a job on some of these pieces, but I felt like the time to do so wasn't quite worth the reward because this is a pretty cartoony character, so I don't need to maximize the detail as much as I would with something more realistic. So your UVs, just think of them as a kind of time versus effort thing and how much texture detail you really need. So you want to think about texel density, which is how large each UV island is in relation to the others. You want to think about the distance between the UVs, which is called the UV padding, to make sure that they have space in case you subdivide your armature or do some other things to it. You want to have square UVs whenever possible, or mostly square UVs, so that way you can have more efficient packing. And you want to also avoid doing any automatic UVing like smart unwrap because it usually just produces pretty mediocre results. But that's a quick kind of look into how I did my UVs for this character, as well as how UVs work in general. So I think I covered the basics there. You just want to mark seams on hard edges or kind of cut things in half, like as if they were paper towels for stuff like cylinders. For hard edged shapes, you want to follow those hard edges or your bevels and mark those. And you want to try and keep seams as invisible as possible. So you want to try and avoid seams on flat surfaces and use your turning points or your corners and junctions to hide your seams there. Then you just want to try and have square seams, and you want to try and pack them as efficiently as possible in the 0 to 1 space. And sometimes a part of that is mirroring and stacking your UVs so that the texture detail can get repeated to things that are going to have the same texture. So that's just a brief crash course into UVs, how they work, and what they do. So I hope that was helpful.